So now that, I think, sets the stage for how complicated this topic becomes. Where does our food come from? It's complicated by not only how it's produced, but how we consider food, how we consider agriculture. So if we take the topic of using genetic modification for crop improvement, what are some of the controversies and concerns that this brings up? If I ask someone in my gym, what is a GMO? And he says, I don't know, but I'm against it. Well, what is this? What do you mean? And then if you ask somebody who actually knows, and I've been thinking about doing the Jay Leno style interview in a grocery store, do you ever eat GMOs? I'm sure I would get a various response, oh no, I would never do that, But what is it? And what are the controversies that are involved? Well, I made a short list of some of these. Some people are, and this is not in any particular order. These are some of the questions that the informed consumer might ask. What about labeling? If they know that they've been eating genetically modified organisms or products made from them for years, why doesn't it say that on the bag? Doesn't the consumer need to know that? And is there a safety issue? Is this some ruse by the large corporations to sell their product to the unsuspecting consumer? What's the safety issue? Is it safe to eat genetically modified plants? So health, could it possibly induce new allergens? If we're making a protein that's an insecticide like BT in corn and we're all consuming this on a large scale, could people be introduced to new allergens? And what about gene flow into wild plants? If I make a genetically modified plant, what's the possibility that it could communicate its genetics to wild relatives, and then we would have Roundup-resistant wild plants that we can't get rid of, super weeds? Or what if I'm an organic farmer and I am growing a product that is no GMOs, and some of your GMO pollen blows into my field? Should I be concerned about my no GMO status? So there's a gene flow idea. And then there's a whole bunch of stories that have occurred over the years since the introduction of genetically modified crops. One is related to a variety of corn that was introduced around year 2000 that was approved for cattle feed but not for human feed. And it found its way into tacos. And Taco Bell was notified that some of this unapproved GMO corn was in their tacos, creating what I refer to now as the taco crisis. So what was that all about? Were humans at risk? And then there was the story that by making insect-resistant corn that is toxic to lepidopteran insects, the technology that I brought up in the last lecture about BT being used as a protein-based insecticide, what's the possibility that this would affect other lepidopteran insects, such as monarch butterflies, which feed on milkweed nearly exclusively, which could be grown in ditches alongside of corn? What's the possibility that BT containing corn pollen would drift onto milkweed plants and that we would affect the monarch butterfly population? And there was a research paper published out of an entomologist lab at Cornell University that looked at this and created a large controversy. Could BT corn be affecting other unintended target species? And this insect resistance factors that we have plants with insect resistance genes in them. What's the possibility antibiotic resistance, that if we have plants with antibiotic resistant genes in them, what's the possibility that that antibiotic resistant trait could be transferred into humans, as I suggested in the previous lecture? But moreover, what's the possibility that that antibiotic resistance gene could be transferred into bacteria in the soil or in your gut, making antibiotic resistance going crazy? Is that possible? Or what's the possibility that we're encouraging resistance to pesticides and herbicides? By using Roundup, aren't we going to select for natural resistance and eventually make Roundup obsolete? Or what about the production of new toxins, concentration of toxic chemicals? All of these become stories, you see. And all of them people have opinions about with very little facts about these. So what I'm going to do during the next part of this lecture is to take on some of these controversies. We can't get to all of them now, and there's some that come up a lot that I won't have the time to touch on, but I love this topic. So here we go. What is behind the turmoil? That given the success of agricultural biotechnology, and that it is so widely used by farmers, 90% of US corn is genetically modified. What's behind the turmoil that would send somebody to the street to protest? Well, I'll consider these issues here. The uncertainty about safety first, then the regulatory issues that result in the labeling and right of choice. Then we'll look at some environmental concerns and the globalization of this technology as it moves into India, China, and other countries. Then the aspect of food culture, that we all have a sensitivity to food. There is Italian food, there's Chinese food, there's German food, there's, I think, American food. But we all have a sensitivity about this food. There's big science and big companies, as I brought up, the idea of crossing the line and playing God and a distrust of science itself. So let's try to take these on sort of one at a time. And this uncertainty about safety first. I mentioned that we just want good food. I think there is part of our American culture and part of our global culture that wants to trust the food that we eat because it's something that we do every day. We are putting something into us every day and are out of control of how that's produced and how it gets to us. So there's a balance then that is struck between large-scale agricultural production methods and food safety. And as I mentioned, previous technologies that have been heralded as safe have proven otherwise. And DDT certainly looms large there, introduced in the 1930s as an insect control method. It's been said that more people would have died of malaria in the Philippines during World War II than died of Japanese bullets if not for DDT. DDT would still be one of the best solutions to stopping malaria in Africa. And it's cheap. And it's banned in the US but not in other countries. Does this mean we should use it? Well, that's an ethical question, isn't it? Do we value birds' eggs more than human lives in Africa? And what about chlorofluorocarbons that turned out to destroy the ozone layer? Certainly we've done a lot at calming that situation down, but now we're confronted with other gases that are apparently affecting our atmosphere. And no matter what we think about climate change, and there is various debates about that, there's one inarguable number, that the parts per million of CO2 that's in our atmosphere now is 388. That's all you need to know. So what are the harmful effects that might arise in the future from the release of genetically modified organisms that remain unseen? Is it good enough just to say, hey, this is safe, let's go ahead? And the controversy on food safety also looms large. We've had a number of incidents globally, from mad cow disease, from feeding animals animal parts, to pesticides used as broad spectrums insecticides. And then there's food safety issues such as E. coli and listeria and salmonella outbreaks. Rachel Carson published this book in 1962, which had a monumental impact. Actually, it gives me chills. If you've not read this, you should. Put it on your reading list. It's as relevant today as it ever was. Silent Spring. that we could eventually use pesticides that would affect bird populations to the point where there aren't any. And DDT was making serious inroads into that effect, weakening the eggshells of predator birds like peregrine falcons and ospreys, so that we can see that by limiting the use of DDT, we now have recovered populations of peregrine falcons and ospreys as a result. So not only do we impact, but our decisions not to impact has consequences. Right on, Rachel Carson. And then there are these controversies of food safety and pesticides, so that post-Rachel Carson, the word pesticide causes shivers in some people, that perhaps we ought to ban all of them. Really? Can we produce large-scale agriculture that way? And controversies such as occurred in the Northwest in this country in the late 1980s, early 1990s, concerning the pesticide Alar that's used on apples, causing some people to protest against using apples from the Northwest. And Oregon and Washington State suffered tremendous economic impact from what turned out to be a red herring. So GMO health concerns swirl around, unintended consequences. If you put this gene in, how do you know what else you're affecting? Production of new toxins could occur. And as I mentioned, food allergies and antibiotic resistance. And I'll get back to this antibiotic resistant question in a later lecture in the pharmaceutical biotechnology section, because certainly there are bacteria that are becoming antibiotic resistant. Think tuberculosis, MRSA. These are concerns. Where does it arise? Is it from the overuse of antibiotics in farm animals or in humans? Or does it arise from genetically modified plants? Different countries have different concerns also about genetic modification in plants. This list comes from a publication from the Plant Journal a number of years ago, looking at some of the regulations that vary across the use of genetically modified plants in different countries. So bioengineered foods, safety and labeling. As I described, there are these list of organizations prevalent in the US and in Europe that oversee the safety and deregulation of these plants. We use the word deregulation because they're regulated until they're proven safe to be released into the environment. And that's a very costly process. For a company to undertake the genetic modification of a trait from beginning to end and oversee the deregulation process, that progression requires about 9 to 15 years of research and expenditure to a company of upwards around, on average, $136 million. So if you just want to willy-nilly put any gene into crops, that's what you're considering, no matter how good that trait might be. But it's the process by which something is produced that is not significant in the United States for labeling purposes, only its content. I mentioned before that if you pick up a can of stewed tomatoes, that the first ingredient will be tomatoes, hopefully. And therefore, the labeling should indicate its content, not the process by which that was produced. Was it produced by hydroponics in a greenhouse? We don't need to label that. Was it produced in the Salinas Valley or in Florida? We don't need to label this. You could say we should, but then every can of tomatoes would come with a very large labeling booklet. So this was decided a long time ago during the establishment of the FDA, and I'll cover that also in the lecture on pharmaceutical biotechnology. But in terms of safety issues for GM foods, let's go over this first. The genetic modification is important. The process itself is reviewed. The The safety of the new protein. If you introduce a protein that is not safe for human consumption, it will not be deregulated through the FDA and launched into the environment. How do we know that? Well, certain projects have been denied on this basis. The occurrence and implications of unintended effects. Is it possible that the gene going in could cause a toxin in the plant to be produced that would affect human health? And then also considered is what is the role of the new food in the diet? Is it prevalent or is it periodically used? What about the allergenicity of new proteins? Certainly if I were to clone a gene for a peanut protein that causes peanut allergies and introduce that into tomatoes, and then you're sitting there on an airplane and you get served a tomato, but you're allergic to peanuts, this could have a consequence if this is not appropriately labeled. But I would ask this, the company itself would self-regulate this process. Why would they want to introduce a product that would be dangerous? That's the last thing their stockholders want to hear. So in fact, some of this is self-policing. And then there's the influence of food processing. Is it possible that through this genetic modification that I could introduce a protein that does not become harmful until it's steamed, stewed, brewed, or whatever? Well, that also needs to be evaluated in terms of safety issues. In evaluating this, the FDA has assumed the concept of substantial equivalence. And this is well documented through legal proceedings dating back to the early 1990s and even prior to that. So it's not merely just a statement, but a whole position regarding the concept of substantial equivalence. And what does this actually mean? Well, we know that a tomato is safe to eat. It's a tomato. Humans have been eating it for a long time. We don't have to go ahead and prove that a tomato is safe to eat every time we produce a new variety. So what the concept of substantial equivalence means that we have a starting point, this tomato, for safety assessment. Then the comparison between a GM organism and its closest traditional counterpart can be interacted. So we have a tomato. If I put a GM counterpart, which would be one gene, into this tomato genome, I don't need to reestablish that the tomato is safe. What I need to establish is that the product of that GM trait is safe in this background. That's the concept of substantial equivalence. And we need to identify intended and unintended differences on which further safety assessment should be focused. In other words, is it possible that I could introduce a gene into this tomato that might have unintended consequences? So this plays out this way when the FDA is considering assessing the safety of GM crops. First, is it substantially equivalent? If so, then no further testing is required as the product has been characterized as substantially equivalent to its traditional counterpart. So in other words, if I've modified how starch is produced in a potato, I don't need to reprove that starch is okay. It's just starch, and that's okay. On the other hand, let's take part two. It's substantially equivalent except for the inserted trait. So the focus of testing safety is on the new trait that's introduced. Take, for example, BT corn. We need now to show that the introduction of an insecticidal protein does not have unintended health effects on humans, or for that matter, other animals. The third category would be not equivalent at all. Not substantially equivalent with a traditionally equivalent crop. You can think about if pharmaceuticals then are made in plants, whether that's vaccines or antibodies that could be used for pharmaceutical purposes, and we can make those in plants. As I said, any gene can now be cloned and produced in plants. And so pharmaceuticals can be made in plants, vaccines can be made in plants. But let's say we're making a human antibody in corn. Do we want that human antibody, one, in your cornflakes, but two, is it safe for human consumption? And then how do we prevent that or regulate that? Another one might be that if we were to make bioplastics in plants, do we want bioplastics finding their way into our cornflakes? So how does the FDA and the EPA regulate this? It's a very expensive and tedious process that the industry is encumbered to perform if they want to launch a new commercial product. And then there are safety evaluations, real or not. Is this thing safe? What are the safety evaluations? How should they be done? Is that by a government agency or is that by some guy like this? What are the risks and the benefits? Is it the company's responsibility? Is it the government's responsibility? Who should the consumer trust in terms of safety evaluations? Okay, so let's get into some of the controversies that have come up over the past in the news about GMOs in food. Starlink corn. The controversy started in September 2000 when an insect-resistant corn variety produced by the Aventis Corporation was released for animal feed but was not approved for human consumption by the FDA. So it was approved by the USDA for production out in the field to be used for cattle feed, primarily, or poultry feed. So in year 2000, this was also the year that Firestone had its tread separation. I don't know if any of you remember this, but there were tires that were bad, causing tread separation, and vehicles were getting in accidents all the time, and so they called it the catastrophic tire recall. And in that same year, we had the catastrophic taco recall, when Taco Bell found out that some of the Aventis corn that had been not approved for human consumption found its way into their tacos. And these were immediately recalled. And I remember the morning that this happened because I went to my local grocery store and I wanted to find some of these tacos so that I could use them in class and say, here's an example of what we're talking about here, you know? And I went into the grocery store and I went to the manager. It was early in the morning because I had to go to class that day. And I went up to the place where they sell taco shells, and the shelf was empty. They had already taken them all off the shelf, and so I went up to the manager and I said, can you get me any of those tacos? And he said, no way, that's illegal. They contain genetically modified organisms. I looked around, I said, so does everything else in here. You know, so there again, right there starts the beginning of the controversy. So what was behind the catastrophic taco recall? Well, they had used a gene from Bacillus thuringiensis that causes insect-resistant corn. 1% of the corn used was unapproved, and critics cited possible food allergens. Was there really a health risk? We eat now the products made from BT corn all of the time. A large percentage of corn products, including those that contain high fructose corn syrup, or even now Taco Bell tacos, contain corn with BT genes in them. The consequences to Aventis was $1 billion in liability, and Aventis Crop Science was acquired by Bayer as largely a consequence to this. What this also points out is the need to prevent gene escape, pollen that contains this gene blowing into other fields, because farmers that were adjacent to Starlink corn production fields also had to be compensated for the loss of their crops. Health concerns, though, from the Taco Bell's incident had never been substantiated. So there was not one health-related consequence that was substantiated by the introduction of that corn. In fact, we would say this, that there's not a single case of a health-related incident associated with any GMO in humans worldwide since its use began. I made the challenge before that if any of you can produce a scientifically based article which substantiates a health-related claim in humans, you'll get an A in this class, and I'll give you $100. And I feel that my money is safe. But from that incident, it was clear. The press thought GMOs are bad, and that's what the public heard. GMOs are bad. They had to recall the tacos. And so I think as far back as 2000, this started to set a precedent in the public mind. Food allergies were cited. What about BT proteins? Are they safe? McDonald's did not use GMO potatoes. I don't know if they do now, but they didn't want any Franken-fries. Really? But instead they do use GMO corn and soy products. A little bit hypocritical, or at least inconsistent. And what about antibiotic and herbicide-resistant selectable markers that are used to be made these? They make the GMOs. They're present in most commercial GMO crops. And here, from this article published in as late as 1997, shows a list of some of the antibiotic-resistant genes that are used in GMO crops, and many of these are still in applications today, as well as others. Toxicity studies on the proteins expressed in commercialized GMOs have been well studied. And this is contrary to a lot of what the public understands about this. A lot of people say, well, really? Have people looked at the possible health concerns? Yeah. And other people would say, well, who's looked at that? Has it been Monsanto? Or maybe Monsanto is just covering up research that shows that there's a health-related concern. Listen, that cannot be the truth. It can simply not be. There are a lot of conspiracists out there who still wonder who shot JFK. That could be. But really, as an independent scientist, if I want to conduct a study on the toxicity of GMOs, I am not going to be prevented from its publication. And if I were able to show that a gene introduced into a GMO had a toxic effect on humans, one, that'd be very controversial for sure, but I'd be funded for the rest of my life. And probably this would illuminate a great area of research. So there's nothing that would prevent me as a university researcher from one, conducting the research, or two, from publishing its results. And here's a list of some of the studies that have been done in a peer-reviewed journal on proteins expressed in commercialized genetically modified crops, evaluating safety issues. And this was published by a group out of Wageningen University in the Netherlands as an independent resource. And you can find lots of substantiating scientific peer-reviewed articles which show that there are no toxicity effects on humans from genetically modified crops. So call that a non-issue. And these studies have been repeatedly performed since this publication in 2001, where no toxicity was found in any substantiated analysis associated with GM crops. And these studies have also been performed on animals. Obviously, our domesticated animals consume large quantities of GM crops. Many of them we kill before old age, however, but we do not see any ill effects on animals from eating genetically modified crops. And these have been performed on laboratory animals such as mice and rats and laboratory primates. Now, what does the future bring? I mentioned that what if we were to engineer in a peanut allergen or a wheat allergen unsuspectedly, or that there are other novel fruit crops? Well, these would fall under that third category I mentioned, under no substantial equivalence, and would have to be regulated accordingly. And you can see that some of these would be beneficial. Can we eliminate the caffeine production pathway out of coffee? I hope not. But there are chemical processes in place for removing caffeine to make decaffeinated coffee. Can we simply knock that out genetically and make decaffeinated coffee without using the expensive chemical process? That'd be one trait that would require study. What about high iron? Can we introduce elevated levels in iron that would ameliorate iron deficiencies? This would be a good thing. Millions of people, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, die or are affected by vitamin A deficiencies. But wait, you think I was talking about iron? Yes. If you have adequate amounts of vitamin A but not enough iron in your system, you don't absorb vitamin A, and the consequence is deleterious anyway, especially to pregnant women. So actually, I've mentioned some of my research projects already. I might as well continue. We're involved with a research project that is funded by an international organization to increase vitamin A and iron quantities in corn for African germplasm with this target trait in mind. And other groups are doing the same thing. And then think about allergenic plants. Peanut allergies are increasing in this country and can be deadly. And this is not GMO peanuts, this is just regular old peanuts. Gluten is the same thing. We have gluten-free this and that. Why is that? Why do we have gluten allergies? And some people are deeply affected by these, and there are other allergens in plants. What's the possibility that you could genetically engineer wheat to take out the gluten that causes allergies? There are people that are doing this. There are even people who have identified the amino acids in gluten which cause the allergy. We can genetically modify those out and make a hypoallergenic wheat. It would be still containing the gluten, just minus 2 amino acids. Pretty good. Or can we genetically modify peanuts to take out the peanut allergy and retain the taste? That'd be useful. So there's a two-edged sword to this argument. By the way, when you engineer gluten out of wheat, you can make a gluten-free wheat, but it makes really lousy bread. So we have selected for wheat that makes decent bread that causes it to rise and be tasty, and the same protein that we selected for that process is one that now we've eaten in quantities or affects us in this way. It's interesting. So new allergens, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. What's the possibility for gene transfer? And what about engineering foods to be more nutritious? Can we increase the protein content? Could we up lysine and other amino acids in plants to make plants that are now already nutritious even more nutritious, better protein complements? Could we introduce vitamin B into plants so that people that are vegetarian would have more of a vitamin complement? This recent article occurred in the March issue 2012 of Nature Biotechnology, and I would recommend you read it. It's a short article called Confronting the Gordian Knot by Giddings et al. And in this list, you see the second author is Ingo Petrikis, who I mentioned as one of the primary principal investigators for making golden rice, the rice that contains high vitamin A. He was also instrumental in some of the early plant transgenic work in the late 80s and early 90s. Nina Fedorov is a professor from Penn State University who's now the president of the National Academy of Sciences. And she worked on transposable elements in plants for a long time. And so I think that's a pretty credible resource here as co-authors. And considering the vast amount of research that's been done on health-related issues concerning GM crops, they come up with this statement, that to our knowledge, every claim of a negative consequence to health or the environment from the use of these crops has failed to withstand scrutiny. So what about regulatory issues and this right of choice? Who does oversee regulatory affairs? Are consumers safe in the biotechnology age? If you have companies willy-nilly putting these genes in, and as I said, that's an expensive process, are the consumers safe? What are the controversies in the food industry? Will all of this technology give us safer food? Who should make the decisions? The politicians? How well informed are they? World organizations? The voters? How informed are they? Maybe the National Science Foundation. Should it be religious leaders? The military? Who do we trust? Well, the consumer has the power, and that'd be the money. So the last thing that the industry would want is an incident which caused a large health-related incident or an environmental incident. So the controversies and concerns. Labeling. People often ask, why isn't this stuff labeled? I showed you products last time that contained ingredients from genetically modified plants. Why doesn't it say on there, this contains genetically modified plants? And in Connecticut, a bill came up to legislature requiring that GMO plants would be labeled. Now think about the consequence of that. Okay, if you're going to do this, really, you're going to need separate fields for GM crops. You're going to need separate grain elevators for GM crops. You're going to need separate railroad cars, separate processing plants, separate grocery stores and handling compartments so that you don't confuse your GM with your non-GM crops. This creates a huge expense that will only be assumed by the consumer. Is that what we want? Really? Is there a need for this? Really? Given that there is no health substantiated consequences to GM crops, do you really want your crops to be labeled that way? Is there a need for that? If there is, the cost to the consumer will be assumed. You will not get your Big Mac for the same price anymore. Okay, that's all well and good, but why does Europe ban GMOs? In Europe, they say no GMOs. Why is that? Well, we can think of several reasons for that. We showed some of them in that polling question. I don't know if things have improved or what people really think about that, but there is still a ban on GMO crops. One thing that we can say about Europe is the way that they produce their food is different. They have small countries, and they can produce locally grown produce. We're a large country with a large farm agricultural system. So those vary and have a consequence on how we can control this. Is it health related? The public in Europe thinks so. But why is that? The public in America thinks so too. In terms of bioengineering, it's good to look at the historical context of this. It's been since 1984 that the first transgenic plants were made, and the FDA responded to that, recognizing that this controversy would eventually develop. And the FDA made a coordinated framework to which it described the products of biotechnology do not differ fundamentally from unmodified organisms or from conventional products. That was all the way back in 1986. And this now leads to the history shown in this slide, where in 1992 we saw the first commercial release of a GM crop as the Flavor Saver tomato that had prolonged shelf life. And in 1997, the regulation of novel foods and novel food ingredients came in force in the EU. Now, this consequence of the European Union banning GM crops has had significant economic impact. The US cannot export its products to Europe. So do we think that this is a bit of a banana war? Oh, we can't import your GM crops. Perhaps there's more at stake here than the health concerns. Perhaps what's at stake is the livelihood of farmers in Europe, competing against large-scale agriculture in the United States that can grow these crops more cheaply, putting the pinch on agricultural production in Europe, right? That would be one reason. I would suspect, though, that another reason is that a large number of these companies that introduced these technologies early were based in the United States, so that the European Union would have to pay for technology that was first introduced in the US. Again, an economic consideration, not a health or environmental concern. A friend of mine joked that when Europe learns how to genetically modify plants the way the Swiss make watches, that everything will probably go well for them. So this coordinated framework back in 1986 actually set the course for how the FDA currently regulates these crops. And notice that right there in the middle is this concept of familiarity. Again, the concept of substantial equivalence plays in. We already know what a tomato is. We don't have to re-describe the tomato. We just need to describe the modifications to that tomato if they've been substantial. And that regulation should be based on the end use of the product and review conducted on a case-by-case basis. That's important too. Case-by-case basis is still how the FDA, the USDA, APHIS, and the EPA regulates genetic modification of crops. Painfully so if you're in industry about this process. So case by case, what gene, what crop, what plant, what environment, what are the consequences? If you put BT into corn, that's one thing. If you put BT into kiwi fruit, that's a whole nother process that has to be deregulated. A whole nother $136 million worth. And a whole nother 10, 15 years worth. So the existing laws have provided adequate authority for regulating the products of biotechnology. Although there is debate about that in some crops, it's still done on a case-by-case basis. If you wanted to release genetically engineered poplar, for example, for its use in biofuels, you would have to confront the issue that there is native poplar trees. Can you affect the genetics of a native population or even create an invasive species? So there are no genetically modified poplar trees that are commercially grown, even though there are good uses to do that. There is still controversy over whether or not we should release genetically modified alfalfa for the same reason. So the FDA regulates that the food product through DNA-based biotechnology must meet the same standard of safety as any other food. It's not above or below that, but any food that's introduced should be safe. And this creates a public record that's available for scrutiny. And the process involves consultation with the developers themselves. So all labeling, whether this is for food or for drugs by the FDA, must be truthful, informative, and not misleading. This goes back to the early formation of the FDA, when in the 1800s people were selling all kinds of snake oil. Beauty washes for this, this will make you young again, this will cure your ailments, when really it's just a bag of hay. So labeling must be truthful, informative, and not misleading. The FDA has not identified any crops that would justify labeling foods because of biotechnology as a class itself. And voluntary labeling is allowed. Now, it's an interesting thing. I've been involved in genetic modification of crops and its research for a long time. And I would have thought, back in the early days, this is perhaps how naive I was as a postdoc, that we would say, hey, this is genetically engineered, and that people would somehow like that, you know, as a new technology. I mean, you all embrace your smartphones and like the next new app and say like, well, that's really cool. Look at what we can do now, you know? But given the fear of science and the characteristics about big companies and big science that I talked about in the previous lecture, owed to the fact that people would rather make labels that say we contain no GMOs, and they will benefit economically from doing so. That's interesting. Contradictory in our culture. So this concept of familiarity still is with us in terms of food safety regulations for foods that are derived from new plant varieties. Meanwhile, there's another interesting contradiction, that there could be the introduction of crops that would be novel and new to our society as a whole and our culture that may have health-related consequences. Many people are allergic to kiwi fruit. Now, I mean, non-genetically engineered, nothing else new but kiwi fruit. And yet it doesn't come with a label that would say, well, a little bit of a warning here. Actually, I myself am allergic to peaches. I found that out once. I didn't start off this way. And so I found this out when I ate a peach one morning, and it was a really good peach. You know, it's the kind that just runs all down your face. And by the end of it, my lips started to swell. I was starting to break out in hives, and by the time I made it to the emergency room, I could barely walk. And so I'm not, and that's a non-genetically modified. I even tried organic peaches. I rubbed them on my arms, and I still break out in hives. It's a tragedy, but nonetheless. So any changes to the composition of major nutrients will be scrutinized by the FDA. Any changes to the level of toxicants that are normally present. Certainly if you wanted to genetically modify tobacco, for example, for increased nicotine, and that could be done. The introduction of genes from a source known to be an allergen, like the peanut allergen, and determination of allergenicity would be scrutinized. Major changes to the food so that it's not recognizable by the consumer. So if you made a peanut into something that didn't look like a peanut anymore, you'd have to somehow justify that. And food that would require a new method for preparation for safe consumption. If you normally stew your tomatoes, but your gene in there rendered those to be somewhat toxic, that also would come under scrutiny. So all of this is done on a case-by-case basis. Every gene, every trait, every plant. And the public looks at this and goes, wow, really? We just want good food. Stop the noise. And this isn't like your cell phone, because you can buy your cell phone from Motorola or Apple or whoever you want. But you eat food every day. And we don't want to sit there and say, hey, is this okay for me? Or is this going to kill me? Oddly enough, we eat some things and do some things that question doesn't seem to bother people. There could also be religious objections to some GMOs. First of all, it's delving into this area like, what are you doing playing God moving these genes around like this? And Prince Philip was famous for quoting that. There are other backdrops to this, like the controversy about RBST in milk production. RBST is a recombinant form of a natural hormone called bovine somatotropin that causes cows to produce more milk. One of the controversies that arises about BST used in milk production is could this genetically engineered hormone be affecting human physiology? Does it cause early adolescence in female humans? I'll get to that in a later lecture. We just want good food. Why all of this? Why does Europe ban GMOs? Back to that article by Giddings et al. Although Europe is sufficiently wealthy to buy its food, the indirect effects of European regulation and attitudes towards GMOs have had an unconscionably inhibitory effect on the introduction of biotech crops in less developed countries in most need of them, particularly on the African continent. So, remember the incident a while back when in Zimbabwe there was a famine, and the US responded with cargo ships with corn that remained at the dock unloaded in spite of a famine because they were GMO. This is astounding. You're starving. You're starving. Either eat this GMO or you're going to die. But the regulatory agencies thought that by accepting GMO grain, they would not be able to export whatever they made to Europe. Also, if you look at this, the ability to grow biotech crops that influence productive agriculture in developing countries would be significant. I mentioned high vitamin A rice or high vitamin A, high iron corn. Do you mean to tell me that because you're anti-GMO, you're going to say no? Or drought-tolerant crops that could be produced in areas where people can't grow crops? And who's making these decisions anyway? I'll get to this when we talk about agricultural ethics. It is imperative that the impediments now obstructing innovations in these critical areas be examined, and those that cannot be justified must be removed. Okay, what about environmental concerns? We had already mentioned pesticides and a threat to health and the environment. We're familiar, since Rachel Carson and others, that toxic compounds are increasing in our environment. Let's face it, maybe one of the biggest threats to human existence and survival will be toxicity. We will toxify ourselves out of existence before we blow ourselves up. I will nearly guarantee that. The amount of toxics in our environment is pervasive and forever increasing. Flame retardants in carpets, plasticizers in your dashboard, plasticizers in your bottled water, estrogen mimics, pervasive in dioxins in the atmosphere from coal burning. It's all around us, and you can't avoid it, no matter what you eat or what you consume. What about cosmetics? They're not even FDA regulated. We smear them all over us, get in a shower, and they wash off into our waterways. Yeah, we can take out E. coli at the sewage treatment plant, But what about those cosmetics that people are smearing on their eyes and taking fingernail polish off with? That's all going into the water. Estrogen from the pill enters the waterway and is a contaminant in the East River and the Hudson River around New York City. Do we think that that has no environmental consequence? Really? That's significant. Actually, caffeine from cups in New York that are just poured on the street ends up in the river. Caffeine is a common water contaminant in New York Harbor. What do we think? This is all benign? Our environment is infused with toxics. Sure, pesticides are a component of that, but it's just a teeny-weeny component. It's all around us. Allergenicities. Do you think it's just GMOs? Do you think it's just vaccines? I'm allergic to peaches. Totally natural peaches. I'm also allergic to penicillin. It's another bummer. Two things with peas. But allergenicity. Why is allergenicity on the increase? Just generally speaking. And then there's carcinogens. Some of these things are highly carcinogenic, even in small amounts. Some of them are hormone mimics. We judge carcinogenicity on the Ames basis. What's the LD50 in terms of causing mutagenesis in Salmonella bacteria is how it's tested. But in parts per trillion, what is the effect of dioxin? What is the effect of a fungicide that actually could be an obesogen and cause obesity pervasive in our population? Some of these things are hormones and hormone mimics. Some of them are carcinogens. And some of them are incredibly persistent. So the things that we introduce now, you might shield yourself every way possible, but they're all around us. Silent Spring. DDT was an estrogen mimic. That's why it made weak bird shells. The pesticides that they used to control mosquitoes for West Nile virus in Fairfield County and north are estrogen mimics and implicated in the softening of lobster shells in Long Island Sound. Are all pesticides unsafe? Some are. Look at the nicotinamides that have recently been implicated in the bee colony collapse. What caused the bee colony collapse? I don't know if you know this story, but honeybees don't come home. They leave, become disoriented, and the whole hive collapses. Why? Was it a virus? Is it a virus? Is it cell phone towers and their location system is disoriented? Or is it the ingestion of a pesticide that mimics nicotinamides that in small amounts accumulates in the queen bee, and then they can't find their way back to the hive? Think about these pesticides, like pesticides that we spray on bees. You ever use any of those? They can kill a bee from 10 yards. So you don't have to get near it. And you see what it does to the bee. It's a neurotoxin. And the bee just quivers until it dies, right? You seen this? And do you want to think that that thing, even though it says it only affects bees, really? Really? Do you mean to tell me that those receptors aren't similar in other organisms? Really? Food chain disruption. If we take out one organism out of this food chain, what now happens to the rest of it? You take out an unintended pest. You might hate mosquitoes. Bats don't. Dragonflies. What happens if you were really able to effectively remove mosquitoes? You might solve malaria, but what else in Gaia would be affected? We mentioned watershed toxicity. there's a, we take water for granted. It's all around us until you can't drink it. Now, let's look at the lighter side of pesticides. Not all pesticides are created equal. I mentioned some are safer than others. And by using pesticides, we have increased yield. There are safer compounds that are continuously being discovered and applied. Mosquito control for malaria. Pest control so that you actually can grow crops effectively. Organic cotton. Really? Have you ever seen cotton growing? Really? The boll weevil is a real organism. And in the old days, when it was human controlled, people used to go into the field and hand pick off the pests. And that was organic cotton, all right. Can we actually grow enough cotton? Maybe we shouldn't use cotton. I love these signs that say cotton, it's all natural. Like hell. There's nothing natural about cotton. It was invented by humans. It uses more pest control and more insecticides than any other crop. There's nothing natural about cotton. You want to do something better for the environment? Wear polyester. Although that's an oil-derived product and has its own downsides. I'm just pointing out the contradictions here. And pesticides kill insects indiscriminately. Largely, most of these don't target a specific organism. So if you think you take one organism out against an ecological background, you're probably mistaken. And even if you do, what are the unintended consequences pleiotropically throughout the ecosystem? In chaos theory, it's well been noted that a butterfly beats its wings in the Amazon and changes the weather in Chicago. I like that, because if you take out one organism, what are the pleiotropic effects as that ramifies through the ecology? You take out all mosquitoes, what happens to the bats? You take out all the bats, what happens to on and on and on. I know an old woman who swallowed a fly, right? Remember that one? I guess she'll die. I know an old woman who swallowed a spider, wiggled and tickled and wiggled inside her. Swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed the fly, right? And so we introduced the mongoose to take care of the cobra. Now there's a mongoose problem. So ag biotech crops actually could lower pesticide and chemical use. The example that we were talking about Bt as a protein. You could lower the use of pesticides by using protein-based pesticides like Bt. You could introduce safer compounds that are biologically based rather than synthetic chemicals. Using pesticides increases fuel use. So you could use less fuel if the plant itself was making its own internal pesticide. Roundup has resulted in the practice of conservation tilling, where you can leave the corn stover in the field and simply plow it back into the soil. And this is good. So a biological basis would have lower environmental impacts. So the use of GM crops could actually have a strong environmentally positive impact. And here's something again from Rachel Carson. Let me read you this quote because I think it's significant, considering that this was not science fiction that she was writing in 1962, and it was anti-pesticide. It was in Silent Spring. A truly extraordinary variety of alternatives to the chemical control of insects is available. Some are already in use and have achieved brilliant success. Others are in the stage of laboratory testing. Still others are little more than ideas in the minds of imaginative scientists waiting for the opportunity to put them to the test. All have this in common. They are biological solutions based on understanding of living organisms they seek to control, and the whole fabric of life to which these organisms belong. Specialists representing various areas from the vast field of biology are contributing. Entomologists, pathologists, geneticists, physiologists, biochemists, and ecologists, all pouring their knowledge and their creative inspirations into the formation of a new science of biotic control. Very cool. So, hearken back to this article that appears from John Losey's lab at Cornell University, looking at the effect of Bt pollen on monarch butterfly larvae. So Bt is a toxin, a protein, that affects only lepidopteran insects. We can eat spoonfuls of it and it's okay. Earthworms can eat it and are unaffected, and so can turtles. No problem. But the monarch butterfly is a lepidopteran larvae, and if it consumes this, could be affected. So John Losey did this study, published in Nature, which I have already espoused the value of as one of the most highly respected scientific peer-reviewed journals in the world. It's published. It was reviewed by a colleague down the hall from him named Tony Shelton, who rejected it. I don't imagine they remained friends. But nonetheless, it was published. Consequently, this was debunked by Tony Shelton in a subsequent article published in this reference in the Plant Journal. Now, first of all, what did John Losey do? He took Bt pollen and he put it on a milkweed plant and put it in a closed container, like a petri dish, and put monarch butterfly larvae on there. This misses a couple of points. First of all, maize is very heavy pollen and pretty much falls straight down. Secondly, apparently, monarch butterfly larvae don't like corn pollen. And if it's present on a milkweed plant, they simply go to one that doesn't have it. Third, they're not nearly subjected to the load of pollen that John Losey introduced in his experiments. So the experiment itself was not good science. And the media looked at this and went out of control. GM pollen's killing the monarch butterflies. And I myself would go to conferences where people would protest by dressing up like dying monarch butterflies, most of them from Greenpeace. So Tony Shelton comes out with this article in a peer-reviewed journal, and the media really doesn't care. Nobody said, hey, that other article was full of it, and caused this outcry in the public that still has not calmed down. So there needs to be some consequence assessment. What about this notion of genetic pollution? That if I genetically modify a poplar tree, that some of those genes could be communicated into the wild. Now, so far I've debunked 2 or 3 serious mythologies about consequences of GM crops. So some of those I would classify as smokescreen issues. They're not real. Safety issues, they're not real. Consequences on monarch butterflies, not real. Genetic pollution, you've got a valid argument. Could you introduce genes into plants that could be communicated into the wild that could have consequence? This is possible. So far, the crops that have been modified, predominantly corn, canola, soybean, and cotton, do not have wild relatives where they're grown. So this idea of genetic communication has largely not been possible, with the exception of canola, I should say. But it would be possible if you made canola with a gene that would make it insect resistant, that in a Darwinian experiment, you could make that resistant plant more fit in its environment than its wild relative. Yeah, I think that's possible, and there's a woman in Ontario that studies this. Susan Warwick, I think is her name. But what about the trait that is not under selective pressure? If you made canola that was Roundup resistant, it never sees Roundup. How long will the unselected trait persist in the environment, in a Darwinian environment? If it's wasteful, it's questionable. Will it just be winnowed out until it no longer exists like any other non-selected gene? It's an experiment in Darwinian selection. You missed my lecture on evolution, though. I think, that would have given it some important backdrop. And then there's the part about genetic pollution, where if I'm growing one crop and your crop contaminates mine, I've got a beef, I guess. And that's, I think, a legitimate problem. And then what if transgenic DNA gets into heirloom varieties, contaminating ancestral crops, like this article that also occurred in Nature. Boy, I'm saying some bad things about Nature here. But I think this points out something. Science is not infallible. It's testable. And as a testable hypothesis, it goes out there and is retested. This article came out of some researchers at Berkeley that had discovered, using the PCR reaction, that there had been gene flow from genetically modified corn grown in Mexico into landrace Mexican mazes. Their PCR was analyzed, and they said that it had dispersed throughout the genome, a quality that had not been observed previously in other genetically modified crops. When this was brought to the attention of the scientific community, even researchers at Berkeley demanded that the article be retracted. Both David Quist and Chapella declined, saying that they stood by their results. So the editor did it for them. This article was retracted by the editors of Nature in a nearly unprecedented move, to say that the science was flawed and it should not have made it through review in the first place. But gene flow remains an issue. This issue of Nature BIotechnology featured a review on the environmental impact of GM crops. And this is an interesting issue, and if you're interested in this topic, should seek it out. Norman Elstrand is probably the foremost expert on hybridization as an avenue of escape for engineered genes, and published this book called Dangerous Liaisons, not only about GM crops, but when cultivated crops mate with their wild relatives. Humans have impacted evolution on this planet perhaps more than any other species. Then there's this idea about liability that goes back to the Starlink corn episode. But what about risk assessment? What are the risks? Are they real? Some are smokescreen issues. Some are public perception. How should they be done? By who? This guy? Huh. So risk assessment. What do we do with risk assessment for anything, really? How do we take this on? Certainly there are unsubstantiated risks. The Earth is flat, you might fall off. Really? I don't think so. There's adequate evidence that shows that the Earth is indeed not flat. Or that polio vaccines are a government plot, or maybe HPV vaccines. Or that the sky is falling, or that all the oxygen in this room could be sucked into that corner and we all suffocate. Then there are calculated risks. Even though more people die in automobile accidents than the Americans killed during the entire Vietnam War, most of us get into a car. Air travel. I'm flying tomorrow. I don't think much of it. Some people do. Motorcycles, a calculated risk. I had a Harley for years. Drove it across the country and back a couple of times. I'm still here. Lightning storms, surgery, bungee jumping. So when you consider risk philosophically, risk equals the hazard divided by the impact times the frequency. It's a case-by-case consideration, just the same way that FDA considers GM crops. So the case-by-case basis, the plant, the trait, the ability to outcross. What is its environmental fitness? All of these come into play. What is the risk? For genetically modified crops, there might be environmental, corporate liability, but public perception is the biggest risk. If you're a company involved in genetically modifying crops, that's probably the one you fear the most. If somebody doesn't buy your stuff and it costs you $136 million to make it, you've got a problem. Okay, globalization, big science, big companies, and distrust of science. We just want good food. Please. The organizations that oversee it, the safety evaluations. Is it good? Is it bad? The opponents to genetic engineering cry out with strenuously conducted campaigns. And the Greenpeace, and the opposition, and the dangers and the positions to GM foods. What are the long-term risks? Perhaps it's corporate control of food chains. Monsanto controls world agriculture. Is that good? There was a time when the US could have considered this as a national security issue, like Los Alamos. If we wanted to tell a country to not make nuclear bombs, wouldn't it be quite a sanction to say you're just not going to eat until you stop it? But we didn't do that. In fact, the technology went in a pipeline, unregulated, to all these different countries, China notwithstanding. So GM practices could result in the production of super weeds. Really? What's the science? What's the evidence? Show me the evidence. I want evidence-based knowledge, not opinions. And the opponents, the conclusion would say it's all bad and we just shouldn't do it. Maybe we ought to all just get in your horse and buggy and go home then. So the opposition and risk assessment can come out even in this statement from Bill Joy, surprisingly, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems, in Wired. It says, the only realistic alternative I see is relinquishment, to limit development of the technologies that are too dangerous. What a Luddite thing to say. By limiting our pursuit of certain kinds of knowledge. Well, just stick your head in the sand then. You know? Hobbes said, knowledge is power. I don't know who said ignorance is bliss, but I think it's most of politicians these days. Risk assessment. What are we getting ourselves into with any of this? If you're afraid, then go home. Okay, food culture and crossing the line. I already mentioned the sensitivity to food that we all have. We eat it all day, we eat it every day. Of course we're going to be sensitive to what we put in our body. Anorexia is a disease that results from control issues. We can control what we put in our bodies, but we can't control virtually anything else. And when it goes to that extreme, that's what happens. But all of these factors play into how we think about food and the diets that result. Eat this way, eat that way. What's good for us? Quite frankly, I'm sick of these fad diets. You know? South Beach this and Atkins that. there's typically two words that they leave out of those books. Genetics. A diet that might be good for you might not be good for you at all. And this might be relative to your genetic background. Exercise is another word that they leave out of there. So, humans are interesting. Why do we have to be told what to eat? That's really amazing. I have a friend that wrote a book on plant-based diets, espousing the importance of that and saying our ancestors were vegetarian, and I don't know what references he was reading, because I will bet anything that if you could go back in time and offer that guy a Big Mac, he wouldn't turn it down because he was a vegetarian. I'm just guessing. Neither Big Macs nor I were there to do that experiment. But also in his book he says that humans are the only adult mammal that drinks milk. My cat, first of all, seems to like milk quite a lot. But secondly, that's a kind of a ridiculous statement that I'm kind of tired of because, well, isn't it true that humans are the only animal that domesticated a cow? And have you ever tried to milk a wild animal? I mean, you could say this about lots of things, right? Humans are the only animal that chews its ice in its drink. Isn't that Truman Capote? Humans are the only animal that flies in an airplane. Humans are the only animals that use an iPad. Will biotechnology help create sustainable agriculture or exacerbate the problems of large agribusiness and monoculture farming?